Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of day it is for you. Welcome to Conversations with Dr. Don. Thank you for tuning in. The show is usually hosted, produced, and broadcast from Portland, Oregon. Oh, and I will be hosting for Dr. Don today. I'm Dr. Valerie Baham-Wright. For you first-time viewers, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like you about who they are and as one-of-a-kind, unique individuals and about whatever topic we've chosen to talk about today. So tonight we're going to be talking about America's Freetowns, and our guest for tonight is Micheal Bishop. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
How are you feeling?
Oh, just great, just great. It's
Great.
a wonderful, beautiful day here in the Pacific Northwest.
Wonderful. So in the first half of the show, we'll be talking about who Micheal is personally and a little bit about his background so that we know how he's arrived at the perspective that he will have on the topic. And we'll talk about other interesting things about his background. In the second segment, we'll talk about the topic of the show. So if you're ready, I'm going to begin by asking Micheal a few questions. So where were you born, Micheal?
Well, Valerie, I was born in Jackson, Mississippi, 1960.
In 1960?
Right. A lot going on in those days in Mississippi.
A lot was going on?
Oh, yes.
And did that have an effect on who you are today?
Oh, absolutely. It did. And for a lot of reasons, of course, that was the height of the civil rights movement. A lot of my family were involved in one way or another with a lot of the events that were happening. And then my father's best friend for some time there, for the first 3-4 years of my life, I think, was Medgar Evers. And then he always remained close to Medgar's brother, Charles Evers. And so, matter of fact, we were virtually neighbors. And so we were always sort of tuned into what was going on or what had happened and why. And as you know, Mr. Evers, Charles Evers, he stayed very active and with various aspects of the civil rights movement, and so we kept up with him, and we worried about him because of what obviously what had happened to Medgar. So that did shape my life in some very pronounced ways, I think.
Oh, so that did affect you early on.
Oh yes, it did. Yes, we did. Yeah, it did. I'm sorry.
And why were you born?
Well, my mother and father met, I think, on a train going to Chicago or coming back from Chicago. Back in those days, a lot of the youths, because it could be perilous for, black youth in those days, a lot of the parents sent their children to Chicago for the summer. And or to work or to get opportunities. A lot of people went to Chicago or up north to work or to get education, and so or visit relatives, because so many black folks had relatives up there. And then so my mother and father were coming back to Mississippi, and that's where they met on the train. And I guess and so years later, 5 children.
5.
5 of us were the result of that. And then too, I was born because obviously there was a power greater than all of us that thought that I had something to contribute or needed to be here to make a difference somehow, and that's the way I like to think about it.
So can you tell me a little bit more about what the reason is that you think that you were here? What is it that you would like to accomplish?
Well, sure, there's a lot that I would like to accomplish, and I think they have to do it. If I had to guess, the gifts that I've got, at least that's what people tell me. There's a few gifts that I have, and one is teaching, instructing. I love to instruct in mathematics, and I love nature as well. And I think beyond all of the other interests that I have, I think if I had to guess or think of one thing or one reason I was put here is to somehow communicate that nature has a lot to tell us, has a lot to teach us about so many things. Whether one is leadership, one is health and healing. I think all of the, I think nature itself reflects the Creator, and who is the Creator? Love. God is love, and love has solutions that are displayed, exemplified in nature every day if we just look and have the openness of heart and mind to see and listen.
That's beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can you tell me about your racial and cultural heritage? Anything
Wow.
about it that's unique or notable?
Well, you know, my mother is of largely native and African and Irish descent. I said largely, I guess that's 300. Yeah, and my father is of African and native descent as well. There's we think also that there was some Semitic or Jewish ancestry there, because my great grandfather was Simon. Simon, what was it? His name was Thomas. I'm sorry, Thomas Bishop. Mm-hmm. But he grew up in the household of a Jewish family. Mm-hmm. And in those days, they didn't say that it was. Well, basically, the way my dad tells it is, my great grandfather Thomas Bishop grew up in the family of the Freeds, and it was a family called the Freeds in Starkville, Mississippi. And the way it was explained to me, he was actually the child of Simon Freed, and so they were a prominent Jewish family in those days. And he had worked for them. They educated him, and he went on to be an accountant in their company, which was called in those days Blumenfeld and Freed's, a big dry goods company there in Starkville, Mississippi. So that really shaped. There's a controversy whether or not he was his son or not in different families. My dad says that he was. I think my granddad as well. But his growing up in their household, whether he was their genetic offspring or not, shaped him, shaped my grandparents, shaped my aunts and uncles on that side of the family in a very powerful way. So,
and that affected you.
Sure, it absolutely did.
As did your mother's heritage as well?
I think my mother's heritage probably had more to shape, my perspectives than anything, because, my dad traveled a lot, and he was in sales, and so he traveled a lot. And my mother was, one thing I spent a lot of time with my grandparents. I'm sorry, my grandmother. My grandfather on my mother's side died. And when I was very young, she would take me out on walks in the woods and tell me stories about the plants that grew there, the wild plants. She used to. I was really fascinated by her. I mean, you'd asked me about heroes, I think a little earlier. She was probably one of my heroes, I think, if not the hero of my life, because as a 5-year-old kid to walk out in the woods. I mean, and where that was in the middle of nowhere, and alone with her. And she always in the woods. She had a machete on her side, and she always wore these nice dresses that had the flowers on them. But I knew she was about business, Mm-hmm. And I never forget we were. But to cut to the chase. Her culture was largely Native American. She was of Irish and Native descent, and she communicated the wisdoms that she had about nature and about the plants that grew there and the animals that grew there was just amazing. Mm-hmm. And she taught me a lot of that, and I think it shaped my views on nature and just about everything else, frankly.
Very interesting. So, do you have a religious preference?
You know, the word religion is a big word. I don't like to think of myself as religious. I think I do believe that there is a God, and I believe that He came in the form of a man, Jesus Christ, and His way, His narrative, His example is the example that I not only believe in, that aspire for, and that's love others as I have loved you. That was the statement that He made, and that was the command, and that's the one tenet that I seek every day to live by.
And your educational background. Can you tell me about your formal training and anything else that has contributed to your knowledge and expertise?
My education was there in Mississippi. I have a bachelor's degree in mathematics, in applied mathematics.
I'm scared of you.
Really interested in mathematics also when I was about the senior in high school, I earned my pilot's license, and that was something that so far as education, it shaped the way I looked at education from then on out. I always related everything back to that. So many lessons, so many powerful experiences. So I draw from those two bodies of knowledge in just about everything I do: aviation and mathematics. And again, the background of a lot of the wisdoms, the native wisdoms that were communicated to me by my grandmother. If I had to think about education, that's it pretty much.
Wow. So you've been a pilot since you were in high school.
Right.
And you're an aviation historian?
Right. I like to think of myself as one. I don't have any formal degrees or professional positions, but I am an aviation historian. From the word go, I think from the age of 4 or 5, I began to study the history of aviation. And in fact, I was I was probably in junior high school. I was sort of an amazing kid, I guess, but by some of the, at least from the standpoint of a lot of the students, because I knew the names of airplanes just by listening to the sound of the engines.
Oh, wow.
And so that used to fascinate people, when I was there.
And how did you learn that? Did your father have a...
No, well, not really. I just, I was so fascinated by airplanes that, and I had so many books, and one of the things my parents did was they were very supportive because they were both educators at one time, and so they, and so I would, it was just such a passion that I knew the sound of them. I mean, just from the sound of them, I knew what it was, and that's just the way it was.
Do you still fly today?
Not as much as I used to. When my daughter came along, I didn't have as much time, and so I sort of put that on the back burner. But a lot of friends are telling me, you need to get back in the cockpit, and I've got a lot of airline pilot friends a few airline pilot friends who think that I need to start flying again. I think I will. I think I'm going to start back and get back up there. They even think I need to fly for the airlines. A couple of them say this. We're running out of pilots, and I'm even thinking about that. So.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I may see you up there at some point.
You just may.
You mentioned daughters. Can you tell me about your family? Are you married? Do you have a partner? You have children? Two daughters, or?
I do. I've got one daughter, and my wife, Malavika. We've been married for about 20 years, and love of my life. So we make quite a team of 3. We're very close. We spend a lot of time together, and even now, she's 15. She's become quite an independent young lady, but we are still pretty close. We have our trials and tribulations like everybody does, but beyond all of that, we've remained pretty close and communicative. And we take hikes on the weekends together and watch movies together, and we have a good time.
Oh, that's a real gift.
It is. Very thankful for that.
So can you tell me about your professional background? What kinds of work have you done?
Sure. My professional background, upon graduating college with a degree in mathematics, I went to pilot training, Navy pilot training, and and then after that, well, I actually didn't stay in the Navy very long. I decided, somewhere in the midst of pilot training, that this is not something that I wanted to continue to pursue. I left pilot training, and from that point, I had an instructor that got me out of a pinch, and he promised me that, whenever I got out of the Navy, that I would teach mathematics for at least a year or two in school. That his point was that we needed men in the classroom, and we needed mathematics teachers. So I made a promise, and to him, and I taught school for about 2 years in Jackson Public School System, mathematics.
Oh, so was it secondary education?
It was, I substituted for a little bit in high school. That would be secondary. It would be junior high was for the most part of that 2 years. Mm-hmm. Seventh, eighth, and ninth grade math.
Okay. And then where did your professional career take you?
From there, I decided I really wanted to apply the mathematics skills and abilities I developed in college. So I went from there as a research statistician for the State Highway Department in Mississippi. I was a transportation planning statistician. Did that for about a year, and then from there, I got a promotion as a health biostatistician for Mississippi State Health Department. Worked there for about a year and a half, and then from there, I started work. I started in the private industry. There was a company called MPNL. It's now the Entergy Corporation, and I got a position there as a market analyst, and had a great time. Worked there for about almost a decade, and that's where I had an opportunity to really, how can I put it, apply and learn about mathematics and statistics and the mathematical modeling, computer simulation in a way, as I put it, where the rubber met the road. We were making big decisions about big marketing campaigns based on the analysis that I was asked to do and some of the analysis that I'd come up with, and it was very exciting. It was stressful at times, but to have $250,000, sometimes $1 million campaigns riding on your your number crunching, it was very rewarding, to say the least, and I learned a tremendous lot about the strength of analytics, but also the weaknesses. That was the most powerful part of it. That, in short, that numbers don't always think what we think they do. In fact, most of the time they don't. I've learned that in just watching data being presented in various and sundry corporate contexts. It doesn't mean what we think. And you hear the statistics on television about this group, that group. Most of them are errant, in my opinion. Most of them, they, as one point, I think I read somewhere, most people use data and statistics like a drunk man uses a lamppost in the night, not to illuminate, but to prop up his weak legs. And so that's the way I think data is used today more than anything.
Have you seen that play out in other areas?
Well, in one way, I think one powerful way, and this happened when I was that started at the State Health Department, because at that time, I think it was in sort of the mid-'80s when the AIDS epidemic hit full bore. And a lot of errant data was produced, or analyses were produced that really disparaged the black community, especially black women. That somehow they were the vectors, if you will, of the AIDS virus, which was totally unfounded. I actually went head-to-head with Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta over that as an analyst with the health department, and they basically admitted that their data in a lot of ways double-dipped a lot of the times. Black women, especially in the state of Mississippi, were errantly sampled. A lot of the data came from the public health clinics, which in Mississippi, it's a very poor state, and most black women rely heavily upon those public health clinics. And what had happened was, by the way, if I may, at a point in time in the state of Mississippi and a lot of places in the South, in order to get WIC, women and infant children, prenatal and postnatal care, the women had to have an AIDS test. So, and so since black women disproportionately, frequented those clinics for prenatal and postnatal care, the sampling was incredibly biased, and so therefore it produced incredibly biased results all over the country, and so it was a real problem. That was the first time that I'd seen the just rampant abuse of that data, and even today, those points of view and perspectives that were produced based on that. Even black people, we as black African Americans have embraced a lot of those falsehoods as truth, and they were based on error and information, or the I don't think it was purposely done, but I believe the failure to adequately vet or data to again recognize what the weaknesses of data are, as well as the strengths, what the limitations are, to expound on a population, what the limitations of sampling, what are the assumptions of sampling. It was just so many things. That was one blaring example that I became very personally involved in, but couldn't, frankly, because there was too much political money. There's too much money flooding that particular that I couldn't do anything about it.
Wow. Wish we had more time to talk about that. Anyway, anything else about your professional background?
Well, from that, after working with the Entergy Corporation, I started a company called Wild Success Institute, which again, we were talking earlier about nature and the wisdoms of my grandmother. And Wild Success Institute, if I had to just sum it up, it's our goal is to help businesses primarily make full benefit of what comes naturally to their organizations, to their people.
What comes naturally?
Yes, right. Well, for example, if you look at teamwork, there's a lot of effort, a lot of money spent on teamwork and team building, and we've got so many books out about organizational structure, what makes effective organization, what makes effective teams, and so on and so forth. Well, and there's always, and so corporations are looking and paying consultants year after year, decade after decade, and employees are inundated with, the 5 steps, the 6 this, the 8 that. And so it becomes sort of like a flavor of the day depending on who management is at that point. And these are things that they look elsewhere. They look outside of their organization to bring things inside to improve, to help the organization change and grow. When in fact, within the organization, there are examples of teamwork, there are examples of excellence from the custodial staff to the CEO that they do every day that's overlooked. And so what we do is help organizations give them a framework or to understand when and how they happen, and then to turn those into best practices. And it goes back to the wisdoms of my grandmother, what the Creeks, if I may I briefly?
Okay, I have a few more questions to get to, but if you could just finish that thought.
Well, what the Creeks, or my grandmother's ancestors did, is that if they wanted to grow plums, for example, they wouldn't go out and find, seedlings or whatever somewhere else. They would look out in nature to see what was already there, and then, if they wanted wild beans, for example, or whatever the case may be, they would just sort of encourage what was there, or grapes. And so therefore you had something that was pest resistant. You had something that had already formulated a balance with that ecosystem. And it's the same way with, or at least that's the way I see it, with organizations. And so therefore, unlike the gardens of coming in, bringing some in, you had to spray pests, you had to worry about pests, you had to worry about the seasons. These things had already formed a dynamic balance. So that's sort of the...
Naturally.
So
okay.
that's the perspective of Wild Success Institute, and that's my professional...
Okay. Couple more questions. Memberships. Do you have any memberships, political, social, or civic organizations?
You know, I had in the past. I've been so busy with family that I have neglected that. I have attended a lot of, I was, one big organization that I was a part of was the Society for Competitor Intelligence Professionals for a long time. And in my analytics, I did competitor intelligence. Oh, I didn't tell you that I started a business. I had my own consultancy after Entergy Corporation called CI Design, short for Competitive Information Design. And so I brought that corporation, I did that from, let's say, 87 to about 96. And so I was members of, in those days, again, that was the main organization because part of my consultancy was competitor intelligence. That was a new field. I went to, it was very exciting. You had former CIA, the Cold War was over, so all of these CIA analysts had to find jobs, you know. So they formed this organization, and there was a tremendous body of knowledge and coursework and big conferences to be held. So I was really active in that for a long time. Now I do attend training and development meetings from time to time. At least I'm going to start back. Let me put it this way. Now my daughter's a little older and she's more independent now.
Right. Do you see mainstream media or alternative media?
You know, I to me, again, and I think I don't tend to draw distinctions when it comes to, I tend to look at things on a spectrum, if you will. You know, in some ways I see mainstream media as alternative media. Okay, in some ways I see, I hope I'm not being too obtuse, in some ways I see alternative media as the real mainstream media, because if I think back to the men, the women that were my heroes back in the 60s, alternative media it looks more like that. You know, they were outspoken, they spoke to the issues. Now, because of the power of advertising and the marketing impetus that's behind a lot of the information, I look at that almost as sort of as an alternative media in and of itself that's strictly market driven. So you know, and there's a spectrum. I see it from one extreme to the other. I wouldn't call it alternative, but a spectrum of those who really have a desire to inform our populace and those who simply want to advertise to it. So.
So it's time for a break. Thank you very much. Hello, welcome back. Thank you for staying tuned. For you viewers who missed the opening of the show, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals and about whatever topic we have chosen to talk about today. And today our topic is America's Freetowns. So let's look a little bit more into what free towns are. What do we mean by free towns or free states?
Well, you know, in the state of Mississippi, Valerie, at during the slave years, which were quite a few, 300-400 years in our history, there was you had you did have slavery, and there was a tremendous struggle for freedom amongst those who were being sold and bought. Our African ancestors. There was a struggle. There was a struggle for freedom. There was a struggle for dignity in the midst of that, because it was. But at the same time, there was you had the confluence of pretty much three struggles. You had the native people who were losing their lands at a tremendous pace to the Spanish, to the French, and then later the British in the Deep South. Mm-hmm. Many wars fought, so that was a tremendous struggle. They were dying from disease. They were, and to a great extent, were enslaved themselves. In fact, the African slave trade was ignited because they weren't immune to the diseases of the Europeans, the way our African ancestors were. Mm-hmm. So you had that struggle, and then the confluence of that, plus during the Civil War, it created another struggle. The Confederacy was after that war got going on a little bit, was in dire need of resources, tremendous resources, and it began to literally drain the resources, the meager resources of the South's poor, most of which did not own slaves. Now, did they benefit? Yes, they did, but they were poor people, or the most middle class, and whatever they had, whether it be middle class, if they didn't have the power of the plantation owners, the Confederate Army had marshals that would confiscate their foodstuffs, their crops, their horses, some cases their homes, and their children, their young boys. From, there was a certain age group, but sometimes that didn't matter. They would take their children, and that created a tremendous. It created a lot of hardship. There was a lot of starvation, a lot of death because of that. So there was these three people, there was a confluence ultimately in a way that was initially before slavery, before the invention of before blacks and whites, before the invention of American race, black folks and white folks saw themselves as sort of poor blacks and poor whites saw themselves as brothers in the same struggle. But then that was quickly thwarted by the invention of the word black and the black codes, and then the elevation of whiteness, if you will. But during the Civil War, the confluence of these three struggles brought these cultures back together. And in that sense, the whites didn't see themselves as the benefactors of either the war or slavery, and they didn't think they had to die from it. And then also in the South, there were quite a few areas, whole sections of the Deep South, whether it be Alabama, Mississippi, that did not believe, whole counties that voted against not only secession, but against slavery. One of them was Jones County, Winston County, also in Alabama. They voted against slavery. They voted against secession, and so therefore they were sympathetic to the cause of the freed slaves, or those who were trying to escape, and the natives, being sympathetic to those who were disenfranchised, allowed both groups to enter into their lands and settle.
So that's how the Freetowns started?
That's how a lot of them started. They started for different reasons, but overall, that's how those people came together. For example, the most notable Freetown that they did the movie Free State of Jones with Matthew McConaughey, that one was started because Newt Knight became disenfranchised with the war, and the fact that he was fighting for a cause that he had no benefit, that benefited him. In fact, it hurt his family. His properties were confiscated, his family was starving. He, in Jones County, where he's from, was an anti-slave county in Mississippi, right in Mississippi. So those people, he met a young woman and who was a black woman, and because they had a similar struggle, they became close. Eventually married, had children. And He welcomed freed slaves onto the properties. There were natives in that area as well at the time who were sympathetic to their cause. So a lot of them happened like that. That's the major one. Then you had another one, Free Woods, Mississippi, which was in another place in Mississippi along the Homachita River, very swampy place I used to run around in. It was, Free Woods was formed in a similar way, but Free Woods was, which was the second sort of biggest. That was founded when a white gentleman, his name was, I think, Miller, if I'm not mistaken. He married a Choctaw woman, and they welcomed people onto their property. I think she married one of her offspring married another black woman. I think her name was Mary. I don't remember her name, but that's how they formed, and they began to allow natives and whites who were disenfranchised and blacks who had escaped to come to those lands, and that's how it happened.
So how did they become known as free towns, and what are the characteristics of a free town?
A free town it had several characteristics. Well, I'll just give you the one where called Madisonville, where my mother's side of the family emerged. Well, one, you had before slavery, or during slavery, you had no slavery. You had no ownership of human beings. That was just absolutely, that was not allowed, or even, that was totally frowned upon and fought against at the force of arms. And the second thing, people were free to marry, to spend time together, to experience life together, to hunt together, to do all of the things, to raise their children together, to educate their children together. That was the other thing. There was no segregation whatsoever. That was the other part of it.
And so there
it was
was
totally free.
Were there free towns in the South? You're talking about examples of free towns in Mississippi.
Yes.
Were there free towns in other states or across the U.S. or?
Well, the word free had a big significance, during slavery, because I'm sure that there were similar towns, but in the Deep South, freedom was, it was in peril, at least for natives as well as blacks. Because natives, again, were forced, they were forced from their lands and their properties, and Africans, we as African peoples, were sold. So freedom was, they were called free towns because they could live where they wanted to live, they could move about where they wanted to move about, they didn't have to go where the government, or at least the plantation owner or the slave catcher, wanted them to go.
So when slavery was abolished, did the free towns go away? Was there less need or more need for them?
Oh, it was probably as much, because Nathan Bedford Forrest. Well, let me just start over. After Civil War, I think nothing really changed in a significant way, at least for the free towns, because they had their freedom. They had won. They'd either bought their freedom or they had escaped, and they were free peoples in these towns, and protected themselves quite well. Again, with the force of arms. But now
they were protecting themselves from what?
Well, during they were fugitives, if you will, fugitive slaves, fugitive white people who supported who were against slavery, who violated the black codes, all of those things, and the native people who were resist. So they were actually outlaws, if you will. So they had the federal government in one way, because with the natives who did not go who resisted removal, and all that together, they had to fight off the feds, and then of course they had to fight off the Southerners and the Confederate Army. So they had their own militias, if you will, to protect themselves from being removed. This was, I like to think of it as the first time when Americans, perhaps even when the first time when Americans literally fought for freedom in our nation. And so yes, and so you ask after slavery, I think at that point, it was perhaps even more necessary. And why I say that is, during the slave years, we had the Civil War, and after the Confederate Army
saw that these were very fierce people and who positioned their towns very strategic location, they just gave up because they had other fish to fry. They had bigger, they had the Union Army barking down the back for a good bit of that. You had Sherman, Tecumseh Sherman coming across the South. You had Grant coming down to take Vicksburg, and those campaigns, Corinth, Shiloh, all of those places they weren't doing so well, let me put it that way. And then you had the battlefields further up the eastern seaboard. So they left them alone because they simply didn't have the men and the materiel to spare. So but then after the Civil War, okay, it freed up all of these resources of the South, if you will. And then you had Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was the former Confederate general, invented the Klan, Ku Klux Klan. And therefore, the raiding parties that became so part and parcel of the Civil War tactic became what the Ku Klux Klan. They were raiding parties. They used that same tactic to attack those areas, and that's where the sheets and all of that. They would on horseback and with arms and swords. They would rush into these black settlements. Like a blitzkrieg, burning, shooting, killing, looting, raping, whatever. And so that became the order of the day. Because, that became the order of the day, especially in Reconstruction when blacks had the right to vote and began to get elected to Congress and in Mississippi legislatures, those sorts of things. They had to stop that. They had at force of arms, they had to stop any independence of these people. And so, yes.
So how prevalent were these free towns?
They were quite prevalent. One thing I think that the most prevalent or the most powerful, if you will, of the free, I would almost call it a whole free state for that matter. You think of the Seminoles, people think of the Seminoles, the Seminole tribe or the Seminole, we got sports teams. Well, the Seminoles were called the Maroons. And the Seminole in Creek in the Muskogee language means fugitive. And so they were the whites called them Maroons because when you mix black and you mix red, what do you get? Mm-hmm. Okay, so most of the entire lands of the Seminoles, those were black natives and black and natives. So, and in fact, Andrew Jackson led his largest campaign. In fact, he never defeated the Seminoles. Who were comprised, like I said, of African slaves in St. Augustine. I think we had talked about that sometime, but that was perhaps the most successful. In fact, what started the wars with the Seminole is that Osceola had a black wife. And the slave catcher caught her. Osceola says, hey, you give me back my wife. They refused, and that started the Indian Wars, which lasted years and years and years, and ended up in a truce. And they never defeated him. So that was perhaps, I think, the largest and most diverse. We called it Seminoles, but the native African confluence is never talked about.
So so there were free towns in the South and across the country. Mm-hmm. And a successful free town, what would it look like?
Well, a successful free town looked like, I guess, every color of the rainbow. Mm-hmm. That's the best way I can see it. I mean, the area where my mother, they settled in an area, even now, there are people there, and you got blacks living there, right down the road, Old Country Road, and you got white people living there and have been living there for centuries. The natives went to Connecticut, who were the left, went to the Choctaw reservation there in Philadelphia, Mississippi, but there's an old church that still remains, their old church that they built, and I've got a picture of it.
Oh, it's still there today.
It's still there, and it's a landmark there, and so they're still there. But what's really fascinating, you have people there from the darkest of dark to the lightest of light. Some of the people you would say who are white, they call themselves black. Some of the people who you would say are Native American call themselves black, or some of the people you would call black call themselves Native American. Again, we were speaking of a spectrum, mm-hmm. and everybody sees each other as family. Mm-hmm. And other than that,
so they started their own businesses, schools,
Oh, exactly.
civic
That's, I forgot to tell you about this. Started their own schools, their own businesses. In fact, there was a great story about my great-grandfather's sister, who was the only teacher there in probably all of Madison County, and she allowed. Speaking of what it looked like, she was Irish by way of England, Sarah Ogden, and she said that their father was William Edward Ogden. He was a white guy, and so they were native African, and their father was Irish, but she was from England. She was a school teacher from England, Irish from England, and she was the only teacher for miles around. And so in the settlement of Madisonville, you had black kids, white kids, native kids, everybody going to school together. And incidentally, there's a story, if I may share briefly. The local white folks who sent their kids there didn't know that these kids were, you know what I mean? They didn't know their kids were going to school with black kids, because they saw out in the town, shopping, and said, well, you're a teacher, we'll send your kids. So their kids walked, half a mile through the woods to go to school. But somehow it got out that they had these kids, and somehow a mob showed up into Madisonville, into the area, and says, hey, we want you to stop educating all of these whatever kids, black kids, native, whatever, and you're going to have to stop this. And she stood there and says, well, if you, of course, armed, I'm sure, if you want, and she stood them down right there, the whole mob. She says, if you want your kids, you don't want your kids going to school with these kids, well, get them out right now. Because we're having school, and we're going to have school with these kids right here. So if you don't like your kids being educated with black kids or native kids or half-breed kids, whatever the case may be, then out you go. Come get them. Take them out of here. And, of course, she had the backup to make that statement and make it stick. And it stuck.
Great story.
Yeah.
What about free towns that were majority black? I know there were a lot of free towns in Texas. There were a few hundred of them there in Florida and across the U.S.
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of all of these towns. As a lot of these towns, if you looked at the ethnic makeup, they ran the full gamut. Some, if you were to go to, you would see more dark-skinned people. Okay, and then some you would see people who were more light-skinned. Okay, and some that if you were to just look at, you would say these were white people. Okay, you'd have to ask them to know which are black or white or whatever the case may be. But the majority of them existed, were sort of the middle ground where you had all kinds of people. So you did have some that were majority. Well, Mound Bayou stands out. Mound Bayou stands out. That was a place that was actually
is that
in Mississippi.
In Mississippi?
And you had some in Texas. I'm not so familiar with the ones way out in Texas, but because my knowledge and history goes all probably no further than West Louisiana, the Cajun experience, because I have a lot of my ancestors were there. But yeah, you did have quite a few. Mound Bayou was, I think, is the closest of what you would call a predominantly or all black free town of freedmen, because it was started by two black men who were former slaves, who were the business managers. I think we had, and I just found out this today. I'd known about it all the time through the Evers family, because they were, Medgar Evers, he worked there. He lived there for a while in Mound Bayou, and there's always Mound Bayou was in the news when I was a kid during the Civil Rights era. It was always in the news. So because they were a predominantly black city, and they were independent, and that was a problem to people in Mississippi.
And do some of these towns still exist today?
Oh, absolutely. Mound Bayou is a town that exists today. It's got a mayor, a black mayor, of course. Well, of course, Jackson has a black mayor today. And Jackson has a black mayor who is a Muslim as well in the city of Jackson. So, and Jackson is a predominantly black town. I mean, you wouldn't think of it as a form of free town, but a lot of those towns still exist in Mississippi today. In fact, a lot of the free towns sort of began to disperse because they had for themselves a genetic bottleneck. So in order to you know, a lot of them moved out, and some of them are, most of them, I think the Freetowns are not in existence anymore, at least the way I understand it.
Just the memories and the
memories.
structures that remain there.
And, you know, they're family reunions, and now they're Facebook pages, which is amazing. You know, Freetowns has a Facebook page. Newtonite, the descendants of Newtonite, they have a Facebook page, which have been the Free State of Jones, and so we kind of, you know, stay in touch that way. And of course, you know, my family stays in touch, and we're doing quite a bit of research.
Is there anything else that you can say that would be of interest or that would educate us about Freetowns, or their impact, benefit?
You know, I think so. I think if there was just one thing, and that is, you know, one of the things that's disappointed me a lot about civil rights activity today is, and that is it's polarizing. Democrat versus Republican, black versus white, you know, and I think back on the Evers, you know, Medgar Evers and Mr. Evers, you know, watching him, and James Meredith, who was a big civil rights, he was a good friend of my mom's. I used to eat lunch with him before I moved up here. We used to have lunch every, you know, once a week and chat with him. These people never uttered a word of antagonism or hatred or insult. They never demeaned the people who we understood as our oppressors. Never did, not once. I never heard Mr. Evers, you know, utter. My dad never did. You know, in fact, one notable. So I think the thing is that the entire civil rights movement happened because there were people of goodwill everywhere, black folks, white folks, natives who worked together. And if it hadn't have happened that way, and they didn't agree. They did not agree. They didn't have the same politics. They didn't even agree on race. But what they understood, they agreed on the value of human dignity. And that's where they stood. That's where they drew the line. I never forget, like, for example, in Madison County, Mississippi, these people, ultra-conservative, they were segregationists. But when the Klan, and this was when my mother was, like, teaching school, this was in the 50s, the Klan wanted to have a major push into Madison County, in the same county where these free towns were. But all of the townspeople lined up right there on Highway 51 at the Madison County line with the sheriff and said, we're not having that here. Again, the Freedom Riders, as I was saying earlier, the Freedom Ride movement would have been destroyed in Mississippi had not white, very powerful white politicians and leaders, businessmen, had decided we are not going to allow this stain. They were literally going to destroy the buses, blow them up, kill all the Freedom Riders the minute they crossed, I think, from either Alabama into Mississippi, I think it was Georgia, from Memphis into Mississippi. But a lot of the leaders, my grandfather got together with a lot of the, they had some secret calls made, and they arranged for highway patrol escort of the Freedom Riders all the way through the state of Mississippi. And these same people, who a lot of them were strict segregationists, they didn't have the same politics, but they even told the black folks, they came up with it. I'm talking about the white people, police. They came up with a secret route because they knew the state. They knew the back roads. They came up with a secret route for them to take. I would like to see that kind of cooperation today. Because that's what works. That's proven, tried, tested.
Right. Dissension
and insulting people or excluding them because they don't see it as you. It's great if they don't see it as you do. They bring strengths. They see perspectives that you don't, and they shouldn't be demeaned because they might disagree a little bit with you or don't see it exactly as you do. And that's, I think, the lesson of the Free Towns for today.
Oh, what practical step would you take today, given the polarization that you see that's affecting us all?
I talked to Mr. Evers about that. One of the big polarizing things that, when the I called Mr. Evers when Donald Trump was elected, and when they boycotted the Congress boycotted the opening of the Civil Rights Museum there when Donald Trump, they sort of disinvited him in a lot of ways. And they invited him, but a lot of congressmen, Mississippi State Black Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus from our government, they just boycotted. They weren't going to go if Trump was there. I called Mr. Evers up, and this is kind of hard for me to talk about, but because that week my dad passed away. I asked my dad the very week that he passed away, probably hours before he passed away, I asked him, what would Megger do about this? How would Megger respond, to Donald Trump? If he could come alive today, how would Megger receive Donald Trump? And he said, Mike, first and foremost, my dad and Megger were veterans of the United States Army. They believed in America when America did not believe in them. They believed in the example. And he said, as a good soldier, as an American, he would have received him as a president with open arms. And so I called and asked Mr. Evers, did any of the congressmen, did anybody call you and ask you, what would Megger do? Because his brother's still here. And he said, nobody from the Mississippi Black Caucus. So I think the answer would be to go back. James Meredith is still here. Mr. Evers is still here. Go back and study these examples. Because what is the whole thing? Those who forget the past are what? You know, they are damned to repeat it. So that's the example. That's the practical approach I would like to see happening today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, it looks like it's time for us to close and get ready to say goodnight. I invite you to give us feedback, both positive and negative, about any aspect of the show. Seriously, it will help us to give you a better show in the future. Now it's time for a few announcements. Oh, thank you for watching, and remember KFC, be kind, be friendly, and be charitable. To you, and to you.